Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, and thank you for joining, especially at this busy time. You know, it's the end of the Bonn Climate Conference and the official opening of the Financing for Development Summit, and things are just getting moving in the real substantive beginning of the negotiations for the UN Tax Convention. So everything is moving. Not to mention there's some other stuff happening in the news in the world. We're here today to discuss new research that is, directly relevant to each of those processes. Um, and at the centre of this, at least in our argument, at the centre of this is the crucial issue of tax sovereignty. You may have heard from the Tax Justice Network the kind of the line we give that tax is our social superpower. I hope you have heard that, but I'm going to just unpack that quickly. When we say tax is our social superpower, we really mean tax is a key tool for the way that we can choose as societies to organize ourselves to live better lives, to live longer, happier, healthier lives together, instead of shorter, nastier, brutal ones alone. Um, and the reason that tax functions in this way is because of what it delivers when we get it right. Um, we tend to talk about the 4 R's, though in fact increasingly the 5 R's. The first one that's easy to think of is revenue. Tax is fundamentally what generates the revenues that allow us to invest in public services, universal public services, in public investment, in effective administration and infrastructure. But tax also delivers redistribution. Without tax playing a role, particularly progressive taxation, the kind of taxes on incomes, profits, capital gains, and wealth, we are unable to address the otherwise large and excessive inequalities that scar our societies, that we know make life worse for everyone, not just people at the wrong end of the distribution. Everyone, on average, for example, lives shorter lives in more unequal societies. So we all benefit by addressing these, and tax is a key tool to do that. But as well as revenue and redistribution, tax also has a role to play in repricing. That's changing the relative prices, the market prices, of things that have significant impacts on public health, for example. So things like the price of tobacco, where individual tobacco consumption has impacts for wider public health, or carbon emissions similarly. The fourth R, though, of tax is the one that's often overlooked and probably the most important: representation. Um, the rallying cry for US independence from the British Empire was no taxation without representation, and that's been heard in a great many colonial contexts, of course. But in fact, the evidence suggests it's really the other way around. Without taxation, you do not get effective political representation. It is precisely when, especially direct taxes, the taxes that are most salient to us, are in place, and people feel that governments are taking and spending their money, that we are also empowered as citizens and taxpayers to hold governments to account. And so over time, one of the only things consistently associated with more representative government, lower corruption, more effective governance and administration, is the share of taxation in government spending. When governments have revenues, for example, from high levels of foreign aid or from natural resource wealth, other sources of revenue that don't rely on taxation of citizens, those relationships are undermined, and we end up over time with more corruption, with worse political representation. A particularly striking finding is that when governments are more reliant on tax for a given total budget, they will spend more of it on things like public health, on good things that people want. But not only that, for a given size of public health budget, where more of the underlying budget comes from tax, it turns out that the same amount of money spent on public health delivers better and more inclusive outcomes on average. This is the social superpower of tax. It's not just about more money, it's money that goes further, that does better. Now, underpinning all of that is the notion of tax sovereignty. States need to have a fair distribution of taxing rights in order to be able to exercise their own sovereignty. And for us as people to be able to hold our governments to account, governments have to have the ability to put in place the kind of especially direct taxes on incomes and profits and capital gains and wealth and so on, that have the most powerful impact in terms of these social superpower outcomes. When the international system fails to deliver a fair distribution of taxing rights and leaves countries without the ability to exercise their sovereignty, then all of us face worse outcomes across the piece. And it turns out that this is at least equally true in respect of issues of climate finance, and that's where we're coming to today, and what we'll be hearing from researchers on shortly. But I want to leave a last bit of context here, because we're living through a moment where the denial of tax sovereignty seems pervasive. We have for decades lived through a time when lower income countries, former colonies for the most part, have seen an unfair distribution of taxing rights. Tax rules have largely been set by the OECD, a group of rich countries who are legally bound to favour the interests of their own members, the 30 or 40 rich countries that make up the OECD. And of course, the effect is predictable, that the taxing rights of lower income countries are systematically denied, with respect to, in particular, most obviously, the ability to tax multinational companies that largely are headquartered in the global north. But in this moment in time, we're seeing that longer term pattern backed by a slide to authoritarian corruption. Now, in February, we called out that President Trump, on his first day back in power in the United States, had posed an enormous threat to the taxing rights of all countries, but including other OECD member countries, by threatening that were they to try to exert their taxing rights, their legitimate taxing rights, over the profits made by US headquartered multinationals in each other country, that the US would come after countries with tariffs and potentially with punitive taxes on companies and investors from those other countries. What we saw yesterday, or over the weekend, I should say, was the G7, the group of most powerful countries, including the US, agreeing to surrender their taxing rights. And if you're a citizen of those countries, that means your taxing rights, in order to gain some kind of guarantee that the US wouldn't take punitive measures against them. The US Secretary of the Treasury has been crowing that this will save US multinationals $100 billion. That's $100 billion that other members of the G7 will not be raising in tax revenues and will need to find elsewhere or make cuts to your public services. And this is a situation that lower income countries recognize well, having consistently been denied the right to their taxing sovereignty over US and other multinationals. This is now a genuinely global issue. At the same time, of course, a lot of those rich countries in the G7 are being forced to accept a target of defense spending in NATO of 5% of GDP, an extraordinary increase in the spending of public revenues, which those countries are currently already struggling to raise. So we're seeing the situation of growing militarism, even at the same time as the leaders of those countries seem entirely unable, or perhaps more accurately, simply unwilling, to address any of the issues, including the genocide of Palestinian people, or to act in Sudan or the Central African Republic, for example. So look, it can be easy in this moment of this constellation of events to feel disempowered with everything that's wrong. But this isn't a moment to give up or to lose hope or imagination. There are many tangible possibilities open to us, open to our governments, if we make effective demands on our governments, and taking active steps to defend our tax sovereignty, including by acting collectively against the threat from the United States and other aspects of that threat, of that slide to authoritarian corruption. That is the path that beckons us if we want to reclaim the social superpower of tax. And this is at least equally true for the urgency of the response that's needed to climate finance. So enough from me. I'm going to hand over to our researchers who've put together this really, I think, and I may be biased here, but I think it's a fantastic piece of work, really bringing these arguments together with detailed quantitative analysis of what exerting our collective tax sovereignty could mean in respect both of climate finance and our ability to fund domestic spending also. So we're joined by Mario Cuenda Garcia and Francisca Mager, and I will say something about their bios. Mario has a PhD from the London School of Economics, and he really specialises in the research team here in empirical research, often using country-by-country reporting data on multinationals, working on the kind of profit shifting estimates that we publish each year in the State of Tax Justice. And he's also done a very good job representing us in the European Commission's platform for tax good governance and at the European Parliament. Francisca is a senior researcher and advocacy lead on climate and inequalities, and she's really led this whole area of work around integrating tax justice and climate justice approaches, and very much in the context of challenging and curbing inequalities. And before joining us, Francisca led very similar work, including at Oxfam, their flagship campaign on inequality, and was at the sustainability think tank, Hot or Cool. And Francisca has degrees from the Free University of Berlin and from the University of Oxford. I always wonder, with the Free University of Berlin, do the other universities of Berlin feel like that's kind of a slight? Are they less free? Are they a bit more, tied to some kind of old ideology? Anyway, I digress. Let me hand over to Francisca and to Mario, who will take us through this research in perhaps about half an hour. In the meantime, let me encourage you all, per the message that should have just come up, to use the Q&A button to pose questions for the panelists, and we'll have a session after the presentation going through the key questions that have arisen. But enough of me. Let me hand over to Francisca, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. I hope you can see the presentation okay now. Yeah, we're still on the first page. And thank you so much for making the time to join us. We know that it's super, super busy, and we're very flattered that we have a good turnout today, and we'll try to keep it as concise and to the point as possible today. So this presentation is not long. You'll be very happy to hear. We don't want to rehash all the details that are in the report, but really want to highlight just some key findings and some key messages that we worked out. So really at the core of this report, and this is not new to anyone working in the movement, and by no means an original contribution that TJN is making, is that the climate finance crisis is a crisis of power and not of resources. And that's in the context of, I think, public finance in general, also at the domestic level, but climate finance in particular, always being framed as the sort of search for new money, something that we have to somehow generate that wasn't there before, that we have to look for very hard, that isn't there yet. And the scarcity narrative that has emerged around that. So we're saying it's a crisis of power and not of actually objective material resources to serve that goal. And we try and show why we think that's the case. So first off, we all know these headline numbers by now. We know that there's a level of debate within the movement around what, climate finance targets we should collectively agree on. But for the purpose of this exercise, we're referring quite a bit to the 1.3 trillion per year number. That's one of the estimates for climate action in the global south by 2030. We're also referring quite a bit to the COP15, I believe it was, $100 billion pledge per year, which a much smaller number has even still so been consistently missed in the size of flows of climate finance from rich countries to poor countries, countries in the global south. And the costs, on top of that, like on the whole, are obviously absolutely staggering. So across mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage around the world, we're looking at least something in the vicinity of $9 trillion or so, if not more, per year. So these numbers are obviously absolutely staggering, and you would understand why the framing of we need to find new money that isn't there is very effective in this context, because they look absolute and they are absolutely huge. It's the kind of transformation of economies that is so wide-reaching and so structural that it makes sense that these numbers are completely overwhelming. So we're saying, and along with many others, that this failure to fund is not actually due to a lack of resources, but to a number of structural constraints and elite capture. And by elite capture, we mean the capture that exists, that comes from, both wealthy individuals and their lobbyists, as well as corporations and multinationals. So here I put the link to the report again, if anyone wants to have it open on the side, and also to our climate justice collection, which lists a number of other resources on the intersection that we've looked at between climate and tax justice before this. Now, the core argument in our report is really that this scarcity is manufactured, and climate finance and any other areas of public finance you could extend this argument to is blocked or restrained not by a lack of objective material resources, but by a lack of tax sovereignty. And lack here, we will articulate this a little bit more as we go along. Lack now here in this context at the beginning is a bit of a catch-all to introduce and get you used to this concept of tax sovereignty in this setting. So tax sovereignty, we just mean very much the basic ability of states to exercise, to have and to exercise the taxing rights that are guaranteed in their constitution or their national setting. So that's what we mean by tax sovereignty without getting overly legal. We know that we work with a lot of legal experts, and that they'll have a slightly more nuanced and a slightly different tax on the whole concept of sovereignty. But for the purpose of this exercise, we want to keep it really to the core of the idea. And tax sovereignty is undermined around the world through different mechanisms and processes. There's things like unfair treaties and the mechanics of profit shifting in reality undermine tax sovereignty. There's corporate and elite capture that plays into why this is a system that has been maintained for so long. And of course, policy choices, in the global north as well, the kind of policy choices that have put the OECD in charge of global tax governance and maintain it there. And obviously, this is just a very short overview. In the report, we go into a lot more detail how these different areas are articulated. If you want to break it down and make it very simple, what we're doing in the report is to say, in terms of these taxing rights, in the global south, sovereignty is fairly constrained. And in the north, we say it is captured. And by that, we mean countries like the UK, for which we have a case study in the report, or Germany, where I live, or and so on. Countries in the global north have a higher level of tax sovereignty, at least on paper. They have the ability, at least in theory, to exercise their taxing rights much more as they intend to. But there's a political and economic capture that means that exercising in practice doesn't happen as much as we wanted to in a progressive manner. Whereas in the Global South, we show and we articulate a lot more of the really structural concerns for how that is really, really constrained. And what we think this justice framing in the context of climate justice should be built on, that should be no surprise to anyone, is the polluter pays principle, obviously, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and a human rights framing, which must guide climate finance negotiations if we were to consider them fair. We also talk quite a bit about a reparations-based frame, so that the idea that climate finance is owed, to get away from this idea of charities or donations or pledges that are kind of begrudging, a lot of blended finance, articulated alongside the architecture of debt that's currently in place, and really try and shift the needle a little bit more towards a framework that's articulated specifically around reparation. Now, the question for us and how we landed at the sovereignty framing is that how can we bring all these different pieces together under a coherent framing device? So rather than continuously talking about sort of more piecemeal approaches to reform that are all important, so progressive tax reforms that punish polluters more, that place more responsibility on polluting corporations, that bring in all these elements of reform that we think are really important. How can we bring them together under a coherent framework that speaks to both what's happening in the global north and the global south? So that's how we're bringing up this idea of sovereignty here. And in the report, we suggest that in an effort to exercise and stop constraining this tax sovereignty, we could be looking at two examples of progressive tax reform. One of them, and you will have heard of them, is a progressive net wealth tax, and the second one is the end of cross-border tax abuse. And these are feasible, progressive, and scalable, as we've tried to show many times in the past through the other work that we do. And together, they would enable countries to meet both domestic public finance and global climate finance needs. So an end to that false scarcity and dichotomy narrative that tries to play out one against the other. And again, here, sovereignty, we think, is a really useful framing device because it can bring these very disparate and different reform proposals in the global north and south together under a coherent framework. And I'll hand over to Mario for a bit to talk you a little bit through. We try to calculate that.
Thank you, Francisca. I'm going to talk about the data, the key statistics of the report, and then I'm going to walk you through our climate finance calculator. So this is not only abstract, there are numbers behind all these proposals. First thing, the moderate net wealth tax, as we modeled it in the tax justice network following the Spanish net wealth tax, could bring up to $2.2 trillion annually. This can be the data and the numbers behind this claim can be found in the reports that we did previously. Secondly, ending cross-border tax abuse, and this is making sure that multinationals pay their fair share of taxes and pay their taxes where they have their economic activity and do not engage into profit shifting, and also putting an end to offshore finance and the ability for wealthy individuals to hide their wealth offshore. Combined, that could bring up to 500 billion annually. And these are data that we estimate annually as part of our State of Tax Justice report. So together, as you can see, that sums up already to nearly $2.7 trillion annually. Compare that to the figures that Francisca showed before about what is needed and what has been agreed. For instance, the figure of the $300 billion agreed at COP29 last year. There's much more money for that. I'm going to share now my screen so that we can see the climate finance calculator, which I think will be very useful to show how this works. Perfect. Can you see my screen? Can you see the fantastic? So basically, we wanted to give you the possibility to have a look at how different scenarios could look like under different funds, and to show you that under all of these scenarios, there is still a false dichotomy between how much you can actually devote to climate finance and how you can have domestically. So you can go to the slider, which is available also on the website next to the report, and decide which size you want of the fund. We set a default number to start of 1.5 trillion for the fund, but you can also look at what a fund could look like if it was up to 300 billion, or if you decided to devote all the extra tax revenues that were collected, if those two tax reforms were implemented to pay for a global climate fund that could be used for mitigations, reparations, and anything related to making sure that we stop climate change. So let's say that we start with for the sake of the argument, I'm going to start to show you a fund which is equal to $1.5 trillion. Then there's a question of how much each country should contribute to this fund. In this case, we decided to look at the historical share of emissions and to look at how much emissions each country emits since, for instance, 1850. And this is data that is used from the global carbon budget. And in this slider, you can decide from when you want to start to estimate tax emissions. You can start from 1850, which is the earliest point for which data is available, but you could decide to start 1900 or the period just after the Second World War, up to even more recent years where there's been important milestones for climate finance. But let me start with 1850, which is to capture as many historical emissions that has been emitted generally from the global north. So how would this look like for a country like, say, the United States? The United States, if you take their emissions since 1850, according to the global carbon budget, the United States are responsible for nearly 25% of historical emissions in the world, right? Under our simple assumption, we estimate then that the United States should contribute around 25% of that figure of 1.5 trillion. And that would give you a gross responsibility contribution of $368 billion. We then also estimate how much each country should receive. And for that, we estimated a vulnerability indicator using the Notre Dame index of vulnerability to climate change. We weighted it by population, and we then assigned a certain amount to receive from the Global Climate Fund, which is dependent on your vulnerability to climate change and your population. The United States, under these calculations, which by the way are explained in the methodology as part of the report, should receive around 46 billion, right? So in this case, the United States are a net contributor because they contribute more to the Global Climate Fund and that they receive. But the big issue with all of these discussions is, as we've been discussing, this argument that, well, this is a lot of money, we cannot pay it. Actually, if the two reforms that we talked about before are implemented, the United States could have up to $777 billion of extra tax revenues from implementing a net wealth tax and clamping on tax abuse, both corporate and offshore finance. This means that with only 47% of that extra tax revenue, the United States could cover its contribution to the Global Climate Fund and still have nearly 400 million to spend domestically, both for climate, if they want domestically, but also for other circumstances. And in this part of the slider, we offer you, and we assume that there's campaigners, policymakers from the Global South that know as well, or from the Global North that might have their numbers in mind for the policies they want to. You can look at actually how much extra could be spent on a global climate fund and how much there will still be domestically. And I've seen in the chat that we have people from different countries. So we could also look at possibilities. I've seen we have people from Cameroon. We can look at Cameroon, for instance. From 1850, there's only 0.02% of the historical share of emissions of the country. The contribution of Cameroon should be very small, up to 237 million, but it should receive, according to our vulnerability indicator, nearly 6 billion of a fund of 1.5. So it would be a net recipient. Could Cameroon meet its responsibility contribution? Yes, it could. Even with a net wealth tax and with clamping tax abuse, Cameroon will have up to 460 billion of extra tax revenues, which means that it could devote half to the Global Climate Fund under 1.5 trillion and still have nearly 220 billion to spend in the global, to spend domestically. I'm going to go back to the presentation now, but I encourage you to look and to play with the slider. You can select all the countries that are in the study. You can play with different years, and you can obviously look at how different sizes of the fund, even under the most ambitious size of spending everything, would look like. So I'm going to stop, but maybe we can continue with your presentation, Francisca, and I'll ask you just to to pass the slides.
Yes, 1 second.
No problem.
I am trying to share. Hang on.
Like that, you can continue. But you might also ask, well, how many countries could actually meet their contributions under this baseline scenario? It could well be that the United States and these countries are just some examples of countries that could make it. Well, actually, if you take a baseline scenario of emissions since 1850 and the 187 countries that we have in the report, there is always a majority of countries that will always have extra domestic revenues after contributing to the Global Climate Fund. At 300 billion, the size of the cup, 89% of countries still have extra domestic revenues to spend after contributing to a fund of the size of 300 billion. At 1.5 trillion, as I was showing you, 58% of the countries still had the possibility. And what is important to bear in mind is that this is a thought exercise. And obviously we could play with possibilities of the fund being recurrent. So if you don't meet because that means you don't meet your contribution in 1 year, it can come after. But as we also have seen, there's some countries that have a lot of extra domestic revenues. And in any political negotiations, one could look at the possibility of these countries spending more. This was just one way of presenting the false scarcity narrative. If we can go to the next slide. Importantly, what I would also like to bring your attention is that there are some jurisdictions missing. And I think it matters to mention these jurisdictions. They're missing because data is missing both on their vulnerability, on their global carbon emissions, and that did not allow us to include them in such a report. And this reflects power and invisibility. They're not absent by chance. Their exclusion often stems because they have contested sovereignty, they are politically marginalized, and very importantly, they're small in size and population, vulnerable to climate change, and often lack full sovereignty. And we can think about places like Puerto Rico, we can think about Hong Kong, we can think about Palestine. They have a limited impact on the fund size by not including them. We're not missing, let's say, a lot in finance for the fund. It would be like up to 0.1%, but it's nonetheless symbolically and politically significant to not have data for these countries that are small and vulnerable to climate change. And importantly, a lot of these jurisdictions that do not have full sovereignty, they tend to be tax havens which have untapped potential for extra tax revenues. Next slide, please. And I'll just finish my section with the concept of tax sovereignty scale. A lot of countries would have, when you look at the extra revenues, the percentage of extra revenues that they have from what they collect right now shows how much they're losing. By that I mean, let's start by the bottom of the table. A place like Timor-Leste, if they implemented the reforms we suggest, they will have up to 30% more domestic tax revenues than what they have right now, which means that they're losing up to 30% of their actual tax revenues in terms of because of profit shifting, because of not implementing a wealth tax, etc., etc. And 19% of countries in the world are above a threshold of 15% of domestic tax revenues. The bulk or the majorities of countries are between 5 and 15%, and Tanzania is an example. But this is also something about the global north, although in a smaller magnitude, there's still 36% of countries which, if they implemented the reforms we suggested, they would have between 0 and 5% more of tax revenues. And Belgium is an example at 7%. What this shows is that all countries, regardless of their income, will benefit from having these reforms and have different levels of endangered or challenged or negated tax sovereignty. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Francisca.
Thank you so much. And I mean, we're covering a lot here. Obviously, there's a lot of work that went into these calculations, and we're trying to keep it as simple as possible. But rest assured that there's a very specific methodology note that comes with this report where we explain everything in more detail, so that hopefully we can have a discussion about the substance of these findings as well later on. So I'm going to go forward. We have two case studies in the report where we try to really show what that like constrained or captured tax sovereignty looks like in specific cases to try and illustrate our points. We're looking first at Tanzania, and without wanting to go into too much detail because it would take a really long time, and it's written down. We're looking at a case where Tanzania litigated with a mining company called Acacia Mining. And first of all, you can see a little bit that the reforms we're talking about, anti-tax abuse reforms and moderate wealth tax, would add a fairly significant amount of money to Tanzania's public budgets if they were successfully implemented. And you could again, the point is not to say that all of this has to be spent on climate finance or even adaptation and mitigation. It's a point about public money in general. So in this case, that would double, for example, the health budget that Tanzania currently has at this moment. Would reduce the reliance on indirect taxes, which are notoriously for being really regressive and so on. So in the case of Tanzania, it's actually not listed there, but these constraints span everything from stabilization clauses in the way that the country got locked into these extractive contracts with a mining company that extracted these really enormous profits over many years. The fact that it was very hard for the country to renegotiate those contracts, the way in which the royalties and the profits were split in between the company or the multinational and the government, and so on and so on. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but just rest assured that it's a perfect illustration for this very restrained idea of tax sovereignty, we think. And then they try to, litigate and renegotiate the contracts and landed themselves in one of these famous investor-state dispute settlements, where the multinational company hired very expensive lawyers and tried to basically just arbitrate and litigate the Tanzanian government into the ground. And that's a really good example of the ways in which tax sovereignty is constrained, and not just in the global south, by the way. I mean, we just had a case in Germany recently, but obviously the risks and the dangers for a government like Tanzania, which has less resources to spend on a process like that, and the dangers are really quite dangerous. So to land yourself in an investor-state dispute settlement in this kind of context is really quite intimidating and dangerous. And we think that this case study offers a number of lessons on sovereignty. I'm really sorry about this, by the way. I might have to grab a glass of water in a moment. The other case study that we're looking at, where we are articulating this idea of sovereignty as being captured, is the UK, where a wealth tax on the top 1% could raise 32 billion per year, and corporate tax reform could end 17 billion, and then again the idea of offshore secrecy, another almost 30 billion. And it's no coincidence that the UK is one of the few big European economies that never had a wealth tax in the first place, right? So we've had a wealth tax in the past in quite a number of countries in the EU. The UK never even had one in the first place, even though it has some of the highest density of very wealthy people in the EU, measured in terms of the population. Obviously, it has the City of London. It has a huge amount of offshore wealth in assets, in real estate, and so on. And yet, it has never had a wealth tax. So why is that? Here we articulate, again, the idea of the sovereignty being captured by elite influence over policy making in the city and beyond, even though these reforms, if they were implemented, could easily fill fund the UK's climate finance share and public budgets. Right, these are the two case studies in the report. And I'm just quickly going to end on some recommendations before I go into a coughing fit, which is possible. We have a number of technical reforms in the report that go beyond just saying, introduce this, you should introduce it. I mean, that's obviously part of any kind of progress coalition, is to have a coalition of willing countries that are willing to push ahead with some of these measures at the domestic level. And we're seeing quite a bit of movement at the moment. Some of you might be familiar with the Global Solidarities Tax Task Force and the number of kind of willing countries that are assembling together there to push progressive tax reform. And of course, beyond that, at the domestic level, you have the multilateral level. And that's only, sorry, reform there is only really possible through the new rules that are being negotiated at the UN Tax Convention for countries to work together to shift power away from the OECD dominance towards more inclusive global rule-making, when the externalities of the rules that happen at one country level inflict harm on other countries. We know that we can't resolve this purely at a domestic level or even at a regional level, and that we need proper multilateral cooperation on that. I'm going to skip these because I can feel that I'm going to start coughing, and just leave them on the screen for now, and grab a glass of water and be right back in 1 second, and so we can go to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Franziska and Marion. Franziska, yes, do have a glass of water. That's okay. Look, there's a question has come in that, Mario, I think perhaps you can take, which is from one of the audience participants, saying, I'm not clear if the figures on the calculator are annual or if they're on another time frame.
That's a very good question. So in terms of the revenues, they are annual. And that is, I would say, the beauty of the two tax reforms that are proposed, that this is something that can be recurrent. It's not a one-off. The wealth tax is designed in a way to be implemented or collected each year, and ending cross-border tax abuse just means that multinationals pay their fair share of taxes on their annual profits, and for that taxes are paid, for instance, on capital gains on wealth that is located offshore and that is now declared to your tax authority. So the revenues are definitely spent. The revenues are definitely something that can be done annually. The figure that we have on the fund is just as part of the thought exercise, as a one-off that can be spent then over a certain amount of time, or it can be given as a lump sum. But yeah, that is the important thing, that revenues are annual for sure. The figure can be interpreted a bit more flexibly.
Thanks, Mario. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and and really shows kind of how much potential there is there, because this could fund all sorts of recurrent spending as well as the kind of fund that's being talked about. Franziska, I hope you've got a glass of water, because I have a question for you. So looking back to the slide that you've left us with, maybe I can sort of ask you to give us a sense of what the politics of climate finance are looking like now. I know we've had this period of a few years where ambition about getting agreement on climate finance and particularly getting countries of the north to meet even a fraction of their responsibilities feels like it's just got stuck. And what you've laid out today is an optimistic path of really how this could be feasible and kind of win-win for countries in the north and the south. But obviously that's going to require kind of an engagement with this type of idea, this type of opportunity. So I wonder, just post-Bonn, what your sense is of how things are looking, and maybe you could say something about how easy it is for climate groups, climate justice groups, to get involved in the UN Tax Convention negotiations, if they're really going to be a key means to deliver the kind of possibilities that you've talked about here.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably lots of people on the call who were in Bonn, and I'm probably not the only one to feel that way, but it was weird, to be honest. And I think COP is going to be strange as well if we're going to see an abstention from the US again. So there is definitely a feeling that certain things are changing very much in the balance of power. But what's the same is that it's very depressing to sit in there and to listen to the negotiations and to really feel the same sense of stuckness that we felt for a really long time when it comes to really agreeing large sums, and to agree them quickly, and to agree them in a way that's fair and that's representative of the damage that was done in the historical missions we talked about earlier. I think that unfortunately hasn't changed, even though the US is now abstaining from lots of these multilateral fora. There's a bit of a vacuum that you can see this in different ways, but the way that I see it is now there's a risk of other rich countries filling that vacuum that the US has left behind with a similar attitude. And so it is a bit more, it's an inflection point in a moment of change where we probably need to double down on the advocacy more than ever before, even though some of the faces in the rooms may look a little bit different going forward. There's no way that the countries in the EU now, will now willingly step up the climate finance commitments that they refused to make in the past, especially if they're committing all this money to defense spending, so on. So it's probably a time for more pressure than ever before, whether the US is in the picture or not. And I think the good news is that in Bonn, I think we heard quite a bit of talk of the UN Tax Convention, and my impression is that it is less niche, much less niche, including in civil society, than it used to be. And so there's slowly I wouldn't call it emerging, but definitely the gap is closing in on how separate these two processes look like. But I would argue they're still quite far apart from each other. And a minority of people in the climate justice movement, I think, are familiar really with the ins and outs of what the convention can deliver for climate justice. So it's very natural that they're focused on the more short-term wins, be it through, say, an excess profit tax on X or Y, or something similar, which would deliver revenue very much in the short term, revenue that's missing, and there's austerity, so it's totally understandable. But then we think the convention really offers a very structural, long-term potential that the climate justice movement can and should get involved in a really substantive way, and not treat the convention as an afterthought or something that's much lower important than, say, COP, for example, but probably much more at a similar level. And I'll close here because I've been talking for a long time, but the example of investor-state dispute settlements is a really good example of that, right? Where we could look at the convention and say, okay, this is finally an opportunity to introduce a dispute settlement mechanism, resolution mechanism, so that we can shift power away from multinationals that try to arbitrate against countries, including in the global south, and try and intimidate them and harass them into compliance with these unfair tax treaties on extracting profits that they've been locked into for such a long time. Sorry, that was really long.
No, that's exactly what we need. And someone in the chat, in the Q&A, has kind of asked the question better than I did, really, which is to say, do you think the climate movement has a role to play in the negotiation of the UN Tax Convention? And if yes, how? What really, ideally, would the climate movement be now doing in respect of the UN Tax Convention? If the climate movement was sort of fully engaged on this, where's the entry point, and what's their kind of ideal role to make this move?
Should I just keep going?
Please.
Okay, I mean, there's lots of different ways to see this, right? There's the more technical avenues, say for certain protocols, like the one around the dispute settlement that I just mentioned. That's a more technical area that I think the movement could put a lot more emphasis on and draw attention to. But then there is, I think, the underlying principles that we mentioned. So the principle, the polluter pays principle, which is operationalized more as the difference at an individual level between what groups contribute in terms of emissions, and then the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which refers kind of more to the collective or the, I suppose, the multinational corporation as an entity. That these are really mainstreamed throughout the negotiations and in the process and the advocacy that happens around it. That it's a process that's grounded in human rights principles. There's a lot to do, I think, to de-technify and make this process really tangible and relevant for the kinds of outcomes that we were looking at today. So be it the missing revenue or the negative externalities that come from these multinationals in terms of climate outcomes. There's so much to get involved in. But as with everything, it's an intersectional exercise where we need to show the connections with a human rights agenda and with an inequality agenda. And I think that's one of the main entry points at a narrative level for the movement. But feel free, Alex, maybe you want to contribute something.
So there is another question on the convention that I might come back to, but I want to ask Mario another question first. Obviously, looking at the numbers, a key part of it is the introduction of national wealth taxes. Now, I think you're pretty familiar with the Spanish approach on which our modelling is based, and I know that was deliberately done, taking not a perfect model, but something that's actually in place that is generating revenues today, to say what's feasible, what could other countries do. But is it really feasible? Do we think other countries could take that on and generate the kind of revenues, the trillions that we're talking about? I guess in the climate space, people are have heard for a long time this idea of billions to trillions, that private finance is going to generate trillions, and it's never happened, and it's never going to happen. And I think as soon as you say trillion, there's a bit of a sense of, they're just making this up. So is this more realistic? Are these trillions from national wealth taxes really within reach for countries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that we need to highlight from this wealth tax proposal is that this is a proposal that actually brings back tax sovereignty, because any country can implement it at any time. It doesn't need to be part of a rewriting of the rules or of a global agreement, right? Countries are sovereign to implement this wealth tax as they do so. And I think it's very interesting that we picked up the Spanish wealth tax. As some people might have guessed, I am from Spain. I am currently in Spain, where we are right now having the earliest heat wave in the history. And as people are gathering today and this week in Seville for the 4th Finance for Development, there will be having temperatures of about 40 degrees. We know that this is the reality already of many people around the world, but it's more and more biting people as well in the global north, and highlighting the urgency of taking these measures to fight climate change. Regarding the Spanish net wealth tax, again, since it allows for tax sovereignty, it doesn't need any agreement and between countries. And the way the Spanish net wealth tax could be implemented is to implement it above a certain threshold that would be a percentage of the wealth distribution of a country. So instead of reaching an absolute level threshold, like saying just people that are billionaires or multimillionaires, they could be implemented on a percentage of the population. And It would be progressive, so it would only need it could be sold as something that only affects the top 1% of the population and only above a certain threshold, which even with small amounts would already bring a lot of these revenues. Now, is it politically feasible? Yes, I believe it is. And is it technically feasible? Again, yes. What is then needed is generally strong beneficial ownership registries, but also a good knowledge of the wealth distribution of a country. And this is something that we could do using public databases at the global level. So as long as these databases are also at the national level, which tax administrations tend to have, it should be possible to implement it at the national level. But just if I really had to have one highlight, would be that this is something that doesn't need any global agreement to push through. Any country could do it, like the UK, as Francisca mentioned it, but other countries could do so too.
Thanks, Mario. Look, we have a last couple of questions, but we had said that we would actually close this now, so I might very quickly just pick up there on Kieran Blissono has a question about the climate calculator, saying that it seems absurd that rich countries like the US are technically eligible to receive funding in our model, even if they're net donors, and suggesting the kind of the Fanning and Hickel model as an alternative based on a global carbon budget. Worth saying, and I know you guys did a lot on this, that we have looked at this and we considered it among other options in the modelling. It isn't something that we've written off, but for this piece of work, we felt there was a kind of a more straightforward path to this. And I think there is something to be said for sort of being explicit about every country being both a recipient and a donor, that even though there are common but differentiated responsibilities, at some level every country is being treated the same. And perhaps the slider shows this approach kind of emphasizing that more. But that's not to say that the Fanning and Hickel model isn't something that is very much in our mind. So future work may indeed go in that direction. And just a last question that was asked. While the political momentum at the UN is crucial, what are the primary challenges to ensure that the tax convention, once adopted, is effectively implemented on the ground? And this is a fundamental question. We have a 2.5 year window of negotiations in which, all being well, starting with the documents that were published on Friday, and you can now see them outlines for the convention and the two early protocols, we are looking to negotiate to get to a convention which in 2028 is open to be ratified. With the US having withdrawn already, those negotiations are in some sense much more straightforward, but the European Union, the UK, and others are still being fairly unhelpful. And so a key piece in terms of getting to a good convention and implementation is for the people of those countries in the north to really be putting pressure on their governments to take ambitious positions in this. I think it's clear from what happened at the G7 the other day that the OECD countries have really given up on the OECD deal. They are accepting whatever the US is going to force on them, including with the apparent $100 billion of revenue losses that they've simply signed up to without even asking their people. We know that governments, that politicians don't see the light. They're not going to hear our arguments and realize that we're right. They don't see the light, but they feel the heat. And it's kind of incumbent on all of us to bring that heat to bear if we want the negotiations to go further and if we want implementation to follow. A convention that was put in place only by G77 countries of the global south, could be extremely powerful, and it would absolutely impact on actors like multinationals headquartered in the US. But a convention that's implemented across the European Union as well is in a different category, and we know that the ability to take that forward effectively as a global consensus, even without the US, and make it effective on US multinationals and others, is just going to be far greater. We can't expect our governments to do that if they are unchallenged. And what happened at the G7, in fact, confirms that what they will do if they're not challenged by us is simply give in to the threats from the US or to corporate lobbying. So if we want the kind of measures that we've talked about here, both the international cooperation that makes wealth taxes possible, effective at the national level, and the measures needed to fight the cross-border tax abuse, if we want these things to come through the convention, we have to be making those demands to our governments in the north as well as the south, bearing in mind that it's the Africa group that's led this process all the way through. The impetus really has to be on the north to get with the program. We need to make sure our governments are fully engaged so that these measures can become a reality and that implementation can happen once the convention's in place. That is far too much from your chair, apologies. Let me thank Mario and Francisca for that great presentation. Thank all of you for the questions and the engagement. I think we've shared the links. The slides will go up on the event page where you registered. This recording will go on YouTube very soon for future reference. Please do keep coming back with questions either about the technical work or the politics of this and how we take it forward. It's only through this wider engagement that we can start shifting the narrative about what's possible on climate finance, on tax sovereignty, and it's only doing that together that we've any chance of making that progress. So thank you again for taking the time, and let's stay in touch on this. Okay, good day.